Welcome, everybody. Welcome the Conservation Committee. And, okay.
Okay.
So,
We're good.
should we move on to Larry?
Well, just a couple of reminders. So these microphones only work if you push the button and the green light illuminates. When you're done talking, if you could push the button again so it glows red, because otherwise what happens is there's an echo effect that gets picked up online, and it becomes very difficult for folks at home to hear what's going on with all the echoing. So push the button once to turn on the mic, push the button again to turn it off when you want to speak. And those folks who are sitting out there, if you want to say something, you're going to have to come up to the table here and use this mic. Same instruction. Otherwise, you're free to sit and listen. So I'm going to turn it over to Hawkins-Hilke from the majority, unless anybody has any changes to the agenda or anything else.
I guess,
public comment.
Yes, right. Public comment. Any comments from the public that's here?
How do we know if somebody's on? How would we know? I don't see any.
They'll show up on the screen, I think, in a little box.
But is this in the view for that? Okay. I just want to say some of us are going to be joining online.
Yes.
Tonight. Some of the conservation.
Oh, good. Great. Yes. Carolyn Gregson also said she would be coming online, so, yeah. Okay, public comment? No public comment at this point. So I'll turn this over to...
Yeah, I'm going to do the introductions, okay?
Great.
Yeah. So I'm going to back up a little bit just so that everybody understands how we got here tonight. The town plan has called for a natural resource inventory of the town for this plan and the last plan. So finally, we were able to contract with Arrowwood Environmental a few years ago to do a two-phase natural resource inventory and mapping. The first phase was mostly remote, taking what maps existed and giving us some map layers about land cover, natural communities, that sort of thing. And then the phase two was a more deep dive into wildlife habitat, looking at where that is and how it connects and all of those things. We had a presentation by Arrowwood back in October, and they went over the whole inventory and gave us some wonderful information. Some of it was pretty high level and a little bit technical. So our Natural Resource Inventory and Mapping Committee, which is myself, Sandy Wilmot, Karen McKnight, Ryan Oakes, and Penny Miller, we asked for assistance with the state. And so what we have today is a bit of an interpretation of what was done in the inventory and mapping by Hawkins-Hilke from he's a community wildlife specialist, biologist, with the Fish and Wildlife, which is part of the Agency of Natural Resource. And this is the sort of work that he does for communities, taking ecological information and making it apply so that planning commissions and conservation commissions can use it in a way that really informs some of our work. So I'll turn it over to Jens, and you can take it away.
Great, thanks. Larry will just bring up the PowerPoint.
I'm going to say just one more thing. What you see here as far as recommendations go, that's what our committee has come up with. In consult with Jens, looking at what other towns have done, we would like to present to the town our recommendations about how to use this information.
I hasn't shared the screen yet, so I need to do that too.
Oh, do you want to do that now?
Yeah. And do you want to turn off this part?
I don't care.
Okay. All right.
All right. While Larry's doing that, thank you all so much for having me. I very much appreciate the opportunity to be with you. Again, my name is Jens. I'm a conservation planner with Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. I've been doing municipal technical assistance for the department since 2006. I made the first maps for Underhill in 2008. I have met with you all before, several times with the Planning Commission and the Conservation Commission. So while you all many of you are new faces, please know that I have a long history of working with Underhill. My work is not showing up well. Here we go.
I did share the screen, so that's why we got the split here,
Yeah.
but there's probably another way to display it. There are PowerPoints down here.
Okay. I work, the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department believes in the conservation of fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. So I am here to represent those interests for the people of Vermont. So that's a big mission. It takes the department in a variety of different directions. My particular part of that is I coordinate the community wildlife program. So I do municipal technical assistance for all 268 Vermont municipalities and 11 regional planning commissions. And as I mentioned, I've been at this for a little bit. The advantage of working with so many different towns is seeing what works and what has worked in other communities, and using that as the beginning, as a starting point for work in each town. I have come to understand just how unique every Vermont community is, so I'm not claiming that what has worked in one town will necessarily work here, but there is some experience behind that. So my work is in mapping, and particularly in terms of interpreting natural resource maps. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the Vermont conservation design, the statewide mapping, and explain some of the concepts that are in there. After that, I want to take sections of the Arrowwood inventory. And essentially, the mapping work that I've done with your Natural Resource Inventory Committee is to take that inventory, explode it into its parts, and reorganize it into tiers that work better for planning, where you can assign, should you choose to regulate, you could assign a regulatory standard to different tiers. The idea is to have this be the beginning of the conversation in terms of you and your mapping committee, in terms of how much is enough. The Goldilocks test, really. Is that too hot? Is that too cold? To be clear, I am not a regulator. I do not have a horse in this race. I am here to help you get what you want. So these are your decisions. What I think does not matter. My job is to interpret the science to the best of my ability, and so I'm here to tell you what I know about the science, and you all are going to tell us how that balances out in terms of all of the things that you're planning for. So just want to be absolutely clear about that and my role. I just want to, last time I actually presented in this room to the Planning Commission last in 2019, and I started the presentation, that presentation with this slide, and I thought it would be fun to do that again, because this is 1870 Underhill, and I just want to think about how much the Underhill landscape has changed. In the late 1800s, Vermont was about 20% forest. It was entirely clear-cut. We had massive landslides because there were so few trees holding the soil in place that the land would slide as soon as we had big rains. And we learned from that mistake and have since dramatically reforested Vermont to the point where we're really the envy of the Northeast in terms of our forest cover and the range of benefits that gives us. So Underhill has seen a thing or two about landscape change over these years. And so I just wanted to begin in that sort of larger context. The conservation design for the state of Vermont is a science-based vision to sustain the state's valued natural areas, forests, waters, wildlife, and plants for future generations. So the idea is this is statewide science that is guiding how much is enough. Where are those most important places? How do different parts of the state rank in terms of their overall priority? All of that is available on the BioFinder website. So this is a statewide prioritization, and I wanted to start by explaining something about that and then putting your inventory results into that context. Really, what has changed since I first started working with you all in 2008 is the quality of the data. The concepts have not changed appreciably in that time, but the quality of the data, the understanding of what you all have here in Underhill has changed dramatically. And so the forest block data that that Arrowwood used is 3,600 times higher resolution than what we started with 10 years ago. So really the mapping has increased dramatically in terms of its accuracy. There's still some things we don't know. Where do all the wildlife cross the roads? I can tell you a few. I can't tell you all of it. We'll get more into that. So the conservation design is this statewide prioritization. It identifies these most important lands and waters. It does more than that. It's a natural climate solution. It helps identify places that are important for where animals can move around, can adjust their range in the face of a changing climate. It also offers environmental services, clean air, clean water. So the design started as a focus on biological diversity and climate resilience, but what it actually gives us is much more than that. It speaks to social and economic values like working farms and forests and other social and economic values and rural character and natural beauty, outdoor recreation. So when I'm talking about these natural resources and these different elements that are part of the inventory that you all received, I want you to understand that a whole range of values are encompassed here, and it represents a way of life and an economy and a culture that is much bigger than just the biological diversity and climate resilience aspects of the inventory. So the statewide design is broken up into different landscape scale components, and I'm introducing this to you because they're important concepts, and those same concepts show up in the inventory that you all commissioned from Arrowwood. So the idea of interior forests, I'll speak to in a moment, connectivity blocks, the connecting landscape, as well as geological diversity and surface waters. Those are huge patterns across the landscape. And so part of what's changed over the time that I've worked with Underhill is this understanding of how the big pattern beyond the town borders, the big pattern of where our forests are and how they're connected to one another matters more than we used to think it does. It did. The pattern is how we get biological diversity, how animals get from the spine of the Greens up into the Suttons in Quebec or over to the Adirondacks. The biological diversity we experience here is in a bigger ecological context. And so we need to understand that bigger ecological context to understand what's going on here in Underhill. So when you look at the map from the BioFinder website at the landscape scale, almost all of Underhill shows up as highest priority. So what do you do with that? Well, that's telling you that from a statewide perspective, the lands and waters that you have here in town are incredibly important in that larger context. The forests that you have, that you enjoy locally, are part of something much bigger. They are large. They are much larger than the forest blocks that we have in the Champlain Valley. They are much more connected than the forest blocks we have in the Champlain Valley. There's a lot going on here ecologically. Now, I know as a planning commission, you cannot say that every square inch of Underhill is ecologically important. People also live here, and you're balancing out a whole range of constraints. So then how do we take this understanding of what's ecologically important and bring it into a planning context? The way we do that is by having better quality, finer scale data, the Arrowwood inventory. So let's go into some of those. Let's just look at some of that work. Well, I'm going to do that in a second. I just want to introduce a few concepts first, but we're going to get into that detail. But first, I just wanted to explain a couple of those concepts that show up in VCD that also show up, VCD, Vermont Conservation Design, that also show up in your inventory. The first is this idea of interior forest. What I'm talking about is the largest forest blocks in each region, in each part of the state. And when I say each region, I'm comparing forest blocks in the Northern Green Mountains to other forests in the Northern Greens. It's apples and oranges to compare forests in the Greens to the Champlain Valley. They're radically different landscape contexts. But as you look within the Northern Green Mountains, the largest forest blocks show up as highest priority in that Vermont conservation design. And those largest forest blocks are important because there's more animals, more species, more biological diversity in larger forest blocks than in smaller forest blocks. So there's more biological diversity in your largest forest blocks. So as you think about what is most ecologically important in town, that is one. And it represents a whole host of species, some of which we don't even know their names, right? There's a tremendous amount of plants and animals out there, perhaps 43,000 species in Vermont. We know a good bit about a few thousand of those. The vast majority of what's out there we don't know. So not only are our forests important for biological diversity, but there's a host of other economic and community values that come with, that are part of that forest. So as we manage our forests, we get different values, and we can have different values across the same forest. We can have places for biological diversity as well as a working forest, as well as places for recreation. You can't necessarily have them all at exactly the same place, but within a forest, you can have all of those different values represented. And so again, as we think about those largest forest blocks, it's not just for the bears, it's for this whole host of economic and cultural and ecological values. Now, another big concept that shows up in the conservation design is this idea of habitat connectivity. So if you just have an island of forest surrounded by development, over time, the species in there are going to become more inbred. They're going to be more likely to blink out when there's a disturbance. A new disease comes through, a new storm, whatever it is. Those species are more likely to blink out. What keeps populations robust is genetic exchange with other populations. And so that's true for forest-dwelling creatures as well as birds and salamanders and everything else. So the extent to which your forests remain connected to one another is critically important for maintaining the biological diversity that's in there. The connections between your forests matter. not just so an animal can get across the road, but so one population can intermix with another population and sustain both of them moving forward. So in the long run, if we just have islands of forest surrounded by development, those will not remain biologically diverse. They have to be connected. So then there are a few species that we can look to get a sense of, well, how much do animals move? How many different forest blocks are they using? What's the sort of scale that different animals are operating on? Well, the average bobcat in the Champlain Valley, a male, has a home range of 26 square miles. Males are moving on average 19 miles per day, every day. Females are moving about 12 miles per day. Your average black bear has a home range between 10,000 and 20,000 acres. They are just as likely to pop out at one end of the largest Underhill forest blocks as they are another. They're using different food sources at different times of year. And so they're mixing it up. They're using different foods in different places. So animals like this give us a sense of this network of connectivity, and they are the poster children for where animals cross roads and how you get that connection between forest blocks. Now, your town's interest in these concepts began in 2011. You hired Native Geographic, Jesse Moore and Matt Colin, to begin a citizen science effort. First, they mapped your largest forest blocks, and then citizens in Underhill did wildlife tracking on all of your town-owned roads to figure out this network of connectivity. That was our first taste of blocks and connectivity, this concept of the biggest forest blocks and the connections between them. So the concept we're looking for here is, here are your big forest blocks. Those are absolutely places for biological diversity. They're critically important home range for all of these far-ranging animals. Then there's another set of forest blocks that, because of their location, in this case, you can't get from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen without going through that forest block in the middle. So I often call these stepping stone blocks. They're not the biggest, they're not the most biologically diverse, but because of their location, they're critically important for connecting the blocks. Then we have micro-connectors. These are wildlife road crossings. These are places where your forests come down to both sides of the road, where animals cross and they can actually move between blocks. And then you can see it, right? Then there's the entire surface water and riparian area network. All of your streams and rivers, those are also a type of connector. Animals are moving along those streams to connect the forest blocks. Now, there's some animals, some species that fall through the cracks. You don't necessarily get a rare species by protecting a large forest. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. There are species of bumblebee in Underhill that you can't figure out where they are based on where there's forest cover. So there's this whole fine-scale set of components in the conservation design and in your inventory that are also important. You can think of these as hotspots of biological diversity. So my first slides were talking about this big pattern, right? Big forests, connection between them, a big pattern that is bigger than Underhill. Now I'm talking about little hotspots of biological diversity within that pattern. Some of them are in your forested network, some of them are outside. Now so we're now going to switch to looking at your inventory and taking components of that, and I want to build a series of maps for you. And so I want to start with elements like this that are most vulnerable. In terms of rare species, for example, you can't just take a little area off the edge of their home range and add it somewhere else and say, it'll work. That's not the way rare species work. You need to have a high protection standard for things that are more sensitive. They're also much smaller area. When we're talking about bigger things like forest, you don't necessarily want a high regulatory standard. You have a lot more flexibility. You can take a little off the edge and not impact its ability to be big, deep forest. So I want to introduce to you this idea of a two-tiered system where you have a higher regulatory standard for things that have smaller range, for things that are more sensitive, that are more vulnerable. And then a second tier for things that are more like that pattern, for things where you can have a lower regulatory standard because you can develop on the edges of the forest blocks. As long as it's not in the middle of that wildlife road crossing, it's not going to impact its ability to be interior forest. So I want to introduce this concept of a two-tiered system with the primary conservation area being smaller elements and the secondary being larger, less sensitive elements. Again, it's up to you all to figure out what goes, how much is enough, what goes in what category, how far you're willing to go. I'm just trying to interpret the science to the best of my abilities. So the Arrowwood inventory offers from 2024 was a significant step forward for Arrowwood because it gave you what I call wall-to-wall natural community map. That packet is going to be relevant on the next slide, I promise. I'm going to start right there on the next slide. So the Arrowwood inventory has this wall-to-wall natural community map. It also identified special habitat features. And so I'm really going to pick up on those first and talk about some of those components. So the first element that's in your handout are rare, threatened, and endangered species. Arrowwood found some, but generally these come from the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, the non-game natural heritage inventory. And you can see that this is a relatively small area. Some of it's on the range, some of it isn't. And these are critically important. They're the most rare, the most vulnerable species. And you'll notice in the bottom of the slide, there are some standards in the zoning, in your existing zoning, that have already been set to protect these. So the concept of rare species is not new to you in Underhill, nor is the protection of those. So that's that's the first thing that I want to, as we build this map of primary and secondary, the first one that I would propose to you are rare species. It's just absolutely, they need to be protected as part of this package. Oh, come on. Man, go to. That's a tough business. I didn't do anything different. All right. So the next is wetlands. And again, wetlands show up in a variety of different places in your zoning. Now, there are two sources for wetland information. The new source is from the Arrowwood inventory, and those are wetland natural communities. The old source is the Vermont Significant Wetland Inventory. That's the available statewide data. Now, the VSWI, Vermont Significant Wetland Inventory, is the data set that the state uses to regulate wetlands based on. It was based on aerial interpretation done in the 1980s and isn't as comprehensive as it could be. So by adding the wetland natural communities that Arrowwood identified in your inventory, you have a much better sense of the wetlands that exist in town. And so, as you well know, there are wetlands across the valleys here in town, and they already show up in those in your zoning. Now, the next concept is forested riparian areas. So riparian means streamside vegetation. So I'm talking about forest on the side of streams. That's a big deal because it cleans water, but as water hits the ground, flows across the ground and into your streams, the forested riparian areas provide a buffer and actually clean that water before it goes into your streams. So there's a water quality aspect to forested riparian areas. There's a flood control aspect to forested riparian areas. When you have fast-moving water, it is slowed down by streamside vegetation. And so your flooding is not as bad when you have vegetation on both sides of your stream. Again, what we learned in the 1880s is if you don't have vegetation beside your streams, you will have raging floods that destroy more life and property. So these forested riparian areas provide ecosystem services, provide things to us. They're also incredibly important for wildlife because they are travel corridors along the streams, and they're an ecotone, a place where different ecosystems meet. And so those are usually the most biologically diverse places. So there's a lot going on in these forested riparian areas. You can see that there is mention of these in your existing zoning with a 50-foot buffer. The way on named streams, and then a 12.5 from top of bank on unnamed streams is what's in your existing zoning. The way Arrowwood mapped these is a little bit bigger than that. And so, I'm just pointing out there's a difference between what Arrowwood mapped and what's in your regulations. From an ecological standpoint, what Arrowwood mapped, 100 feet on both sides of the stream, it makes a tremendous amount of sense ecologically. Again, I'm just presenting the ecology here. I know you all have a balancing act, but that is much more reasonable ecologically. So then I mentioned that Arrowwood gave you a wall-to-wall natural community map. Some of those natural communities, and here I'm talking, we used to call them ecosystems. They're things like northern hardwood forest or silver maple ostrich fern floodplain forest. We name them based on the dominant plants, but what we're getting at is this interaction between living and non-living things. There are some that are more rare. There are fewer of them. There are fewer types like that. And so the S1, S2, and S3, that's a state rank, and it speaks to how rare it is. So the more rare communities are in Underhill, higher elevation associated with the top of generally with the top of Mansfield. So montane spruce fir is a more rare natural community type than your northern hardwood forest, this kind of mid-slope stuff. So what you see on the map is those patches of rare natural communities. So then there's this concept of connectivity. And I mentioned that before in the context of the Vermont Conservation Design. Now let me just explain this map that you're seeing. So, connectivity. You've got a big block on one side, a big block on the other, and the place in the middle, the stepping stone, that's the connectivity area. So what's mapped here is an Arrowwood model on places where there are connections between the big blocks of forest. So this is completely irrelevant without the big blocks of forest on either side, right? The connectivity doesn't matter at all if we develop the forest on both sides of it. But the forest on both sides doesn't perform as well if you don't have connections between them. So the connectivity model is places along all of your major roads where there are potential connections between the forest blocks. Now in Underhill, your you have ridges that run north-south. You have good connectivity north to south. What's missing is opportunities for, or what's potentially in danger, I should say, is east-west connectivity. Going from upland down into the valley of the road and back up from one ridge to the next. So that's what this model is trying to get at. Now, to be clear, this is a model that Arrowwood created. This is not field data based on where animals cross the road. But also keep in mind that where animals cross the road one year isn't that significant. So even if you'd paid Arrowwood to do in-depth field inventory in one season, it wouldn't tell you nearly as much as you need to know. From a conservation biology standpoint, if an animal moves from one population to another population once a generation, it's enough for that genetic exchange. So my point here is that the scale at which we pay for inventory doesn't tell us all the information we need to figure out the larger pattern of connectivity. So we use models to figure out where potential crossings are, and not just where somebody saw a deer cross from one side to the next. There's a lot of area here, and field, if this is a place where you might want more in-depth field work to figure out where those are. But the problem is, Underhill actually has a lot of good quality habitat on both sides of the road. So your field work isn't necessarily going to point to a particular spot. In Burlington, you can point to a very particular spot because the landscape is so developed, there's really only one spot where there's forest on both sides of the road. In Underhill, that isn't the case. So that's great for your ecology. It also makes your job in the Planning Commission more difficult because an ecologist isn't necessarily going to be able to tell you that one stretch of road is more important than another. I mean, I can tell you that, let me put a finer point on that. An ecologist isn't going to be able to tell you that one spot where there are trees on both sides of the road is more important than another spot where there are trees on both sides of the road. Are you all with me on that? So there's a lot to say about this connectivity model, and let's talk about this more in the end. I just want to get through telling you about all the pieces, and then we can go back to this Goldilocks test of how much is enough. So vernal pools, that's a type of wetland. It's a type of wetland where there are not fish or predators, and so you get really unique life forms. So vernal, they fill up in the spring after the snow melt, they dry out in the midsummer, and then they fill up again in the winter. So the fact that they dry up is what means there's no permanent fish population in there that would eat all the eggs for salamanders or fairy shrimp or all sorts of other things. So these are a really unique type of wetland. In this primary conservation area, in this highest tier, we put a 100-foot buffer around the vernal pool. And that's the life zone. That's where the pool exists. That's where the life happens. So species like salamanders, that's where they're going to be in the spring, is in the pool itself. And so that, we really think the entirety of that 100-foot area is important for maintaining the vernal pool, that they're very vulnerable, that they're very important sensitive. So we put this 100-foot buffer in the primary conservation area, what the inventory committee is recommending as this highest regulatory standard. I'm going to talk about vernal pools again in the secondary. I'm going to talk about movement in the secondary with a bigger buffer. But for right now, let's just keep vernal pools, this 100-foot buffer, in the primary, in this most sensitive area. Then there are rivers and streams, and a 50-foot buffer on every river and stream. Now, remember that we already talked about forested riparian areas with a 100-foot buffer on both sides. So those are places where you still have vegetation on both sides of your stream, those forested riparian. Basically, all this does for you is it adds places where you don't have cover right now. There isn't streamside vegetation. And so by putting this in your primary conservation area, you're effectively saying, even if there isn't vegetation there, we don't think there should be development right beside a stream. I think after all the flooding we've had in the last few years, that isn't a radical statement. You've already incorporated that into your zoning, is this buffer on rivers and streams. Okay, now why are things moving all around here? Okay, so then the last one is lands at or above 1,500 feet. Now, this already appears in your zoning as a, well, you can read the specifics. So I just mapped this. I don't know if you all have maps of this area or not, but I just used the 1,500-foot contour and to show you what that area actually looks like. So this is already an existing regulation that you have, and it makes ecological sense. Higher elevation lands are more fragile. The impacts of development at higher elevation are felt all the way down the hill. There's a lot to say about this. So that makes total sense. It's actually the largest area within what this primary conservation area. Okay, so that's the suite of components that in my ecological opinion, are the most sensitive and would require the highest regulatory standard. And so I put them all together here using the same colors that showed up in the PowerPoint. So to just try and give you a sense of what came from where. So again, that yellow is the highest, is the lands above 1,500 feet. That's the largest area. And the purple is that connectivity model. The red are the vernal pools. The blue is the forested riparian, and also the rivers and streams. So I'm just trying to be as transparent as I can about how we came up with what we came up with. Okay. I'll just put those all in one color for you, just to show you what that area is. This is the same map that we had before. Wow, we're advancing on our own now.
What you wanted, right?
Wow, a tough room. So I just put them in the same color. When we build the secondary, I'll put that in orange, and then you can see the red and the orange together for the primary and the secondary. All right, so now, again, the secondary. We think these areas are important, but they merit a lower regulatory standard. They are not as sensitive as the elements that we put in the primary. They're ecologically important, but they're a lot less vulnerable. So early successional habitats. As you well know, Vermont has a very even-aged forest. It's a middle-aged forest, and most of Vermont is that middle-aged forest. There's nothing wrong with being middle-aged, but it is better when you have some diversity, and older forests and younger forests. And so what we're talking about here is some younger forests where there's more food for more animals. There's not a lot of food in that middle-aged forest compared to the browse that's available in some of these early successional habitats. And so that's what we're getting at here. Again, that's not as sensitive. It's management dependent. It can move around, but it is ecologically important. Mast stands. So mast, hard mast, I'm really talking about acorns and beech nuts that are important food for bears, turkey, a variety of different animals. So hard mast, the bears go up into the beach stands in the fall. They gorge themselves on beech nuts with as many calories as, packing that calorie-rich diet so that they can get through the winter. So mast stands are just incredibly important food buffets for wildlife. There are a lot of beach stands in Underhill. You could argue that would be a primary. We put that in the secondary, just based on how many of them you have here in Underhill. Ledges, talus, cliffs. You know that cats and dogs do battle. They do. And cats, the bobcat in particular, gets away from dogs by using places like ledges and cliffs. A bobcat can actually jump from a 4-foot wide ledge. They can jump vertically 6 feet straight up and land on another ledge. So these talus communities there's a unique assemblage of plants, and it's a haven for bobcats to get away from coyote. So there are a variety of rare plants and animals that use these ledges, talus, and cliffs, and so they're a hot spot of biological diversity. Tough to see on the map from this distance, but you do have a fair number of them. Those are already somewhat protected in the existing zoning, and we again put those in that secondary conservation area. Again, other towns might well have put those in the primary. They are very special natural communities, but we do have a lot of them in Underhill. Now, remember I talked about the S rank in natural communities about rarity? So the S4 and S5 natural communities are much more common. Your beech, birch, maple, your northern hardwood forest, we've got lots of it in Underhill. And if this is a natural community type that makes up the vast majority of your forests, we call them matrix forests. So they're important. These are the core forests, the anchors of biological diversity. That these are the blocks that the connectivity areas connect. So again, beech, birch, maple is really common. Northern hardwood forest, very common. But again, as I said at the outset, your forests are home to biological diversity, some of which we don't know anything about. So we put these as basically the background layer of your secondary conservation area. They're important, but we have a lot of flexibility here because we've got a lot of those S4, S5, those pretty common upland natural community types. Now, I mentioned vernal pools earlier. It's hard to see, but this is actually a donut. I took out the 100-foot life zone in the middle, and I added 500-foot a buffer around the outside, so it's a 600-foot buffer from the middle. But this is the movement zone. So salamanders they move about 600 feet a year from the uplands where they overwinter down into the wetlands. And so 600-foot buffer is where salamanders are moving between upland and wetland, and that's why you have this buffer. There's some flexibility here in terms of, salamanders aren't necessarily coming from every direction towards the vernal pool. So we found it was appropriate to put those in the secondary conservation area. Okay, so then here are the secondary conservation areas. And again, these are colored based on the same colors I used before. And again, those S4, S5 natural communities are the largest area in the secondary. Now, this map, I didn't remove the primary from this version. So here we can see the secondary as just the orange without the primary in it. So remember, this is that high elevation above 1,500 feet, and then the riparian areas. And then here I put the two of them together, the primary and the secondary. So, again, this is meant to be the beginning of a conversation in terms of here, to the best of our abilities, we've put forth what we think is most ecologically important. We've rearranged your inventory to put them into tiers to make it more easy to plan and regulate based on them, based on their sensitivity, their vulnerability. From an ecological standpoint, this is a really good compromise for being clear about what's most important and where we have more flexibility in terms of allowing for a lower regulatory standard. Now, I'll just finish up. I know you all, this is a balancing act. We are planning for all sorts of different things. But your healthy forest, your healthy landscape is what contributes to your healthy economy and your healthy community. So I know that there are competing values here, and you're trying to plan for a whole range of things. But I will just remind you that we're talking about more here than just forest health or ecosystem health. We're talking about the recreation values, the economic values, the ecosystem services, the climate resilience that is all part of this. So it's a balancing act for sure, but in my opinion, the health of your natural landscape is what gives you health in your economy and health in your community. So that's what I have in terms of explaining the science and bringing forth what the Inventory and Natural Resource Committee has come up with to date. Sandy?
Just a few points that will help people when you want a little more detail than what's here. You can refer to the Arrowwood report. There's a few charts that are in here that I think are very valuable to interpret things. One of them is a compilation of each of the natural communities that they found, how frequent they were. For example, how many vernal pools were there? There were 22, that sort of thing. So you can refer to that in terms of, trying to figure out how much area and occurrences there are. Another chart in here that I think you'll find valuable is it looks really fine print, but what it is there, each of the forest blocks that they identified has specific information about the number of wetlands, the amount of early successional habitat, so that if the map isn't really showing you what you want for a certain area, you can refer to this to see, what values they found within each forest block. And if you don't have a hard copy and you want one, let me know, we can get those to you, but it is still online for you to access. Let's see, I did want to clarify the riparian areas. Where Arrowwood mapped is from the center of the stream, and that's a little bit different than what our regulations are. So you can just bear that in mind a little bit, how we want to adjust, what we have versus what was measured there. Yeah, so those were just a few details I wanted to add to what Jens talked about. The process that we would like to take going forward, in a minute I'm going to open it to questions and discussion. I did want to just talk about next steps as far as the Planning Commission goes. The intent is to work more with Jens in the future and start discussing these specific tiers and what we think should happen in terms of regulation or management. The secondary tiers, I think, provides a lot of opportunity, especially for the Conservation Commission, to come up with management recommendations that could be part of outreach to landowners so that they are helping us protect certain areas that they may not know exist on their properties. So that will be a really important outreach component of it. In terms of the primary conservation areas, our committee has discussed our first approach would be to say no disturbance. We want to keep these as they are so that we're protecting the highest values that we can there. In discussions with some of the members that are on the DRB, we realize that some of our regulations talk not about disturbance, but more about development. So there's a real big difference between saying, okay, you can't develop this area versus you can't cut down all the trees or, manipulate things in a different way. So we'll need to have that discussion also. So I'll end there, and people can ask questions or offer comments.
I had just a quick question of curiosity. Did you by chance, for like the primary conservation area, figure out what this ratio or percentage of Underhill landmass is underneath that standard?
I didn't do that math,
Okay.
but I can.
I was just curious.
Yeah.
If you want to, if you're bored.
Yeah, it's that lands above 1,500 feet is the most significant chunk of that.
Yeah, I'll just add that a lot of the red area you see that's above that, it belongs to the state or the federal government. So it may look like a huge amount. So if you were going to do a ratio on the lands that we have any influence over, you'd probably want to exclude that from any kind of analysis.
Have you seen how other towns address that? Like, so we don't have any. We've talked about this, and I know it's come in question in a subdivision or two, probably. But the DRB has no real jurisdiction over it, so you could build right in the middle of a wildlife corridor. Do other towns really restrict that? Like, can you give us an example of one that you're aware of and how they address that?
Jericho just created a natural resource overlay district in 2019, and they do that through two ways. They have the forest block piece shows up in their NRO, natural resource overlay, and they have some height, I forget what it is, lands above 1,000 feet or something. They're a little lower than you all, and wildlife road crossings. So they looked specifically, it's very similar to your connectivity model, but they're very discrete road areas. And so they have a standard for limiting development right beside the road in those areas. So that's one approach, is looking at wildlife road crossings and saying, we don't want development in these road segments. If your parcel's bigger than that, push your proposed development to one side of that or the other, or move it back away from the road.
So they recently added that to their bylaw.
Yes. Yeah. Another way of handling that is just a connectivity overlay district. The town of Hyde Park is one. Shrewsbury, Hartford, I could name more, but I'm blanking. And so those are much larger areas that include both the core, the big forest, the pinch point, the road connections, and the big forest on the other side. So the way a lot of those work is having one standard for that whole area. That's a problem because the forest blocks on both sides aren't as sensitive as the road crossing in the middle. But what it does do is acknowledge that the road crossing in the middle doesn't matter unless you have forest blocks on both sides. But there are a variety of ways of doing an overlay district that can get at that nuance. So you could have a tiered system within your overlay district. So an overlay district is is a tool for doing that. Town of Enosburg uses driveway length to try and limit fragmentation deep into its forest blocks. So they've cut down on the size of the driveway length. They actually limit the length of your driveway. Yes, to try and, so if you have a mile-long driveway, you're penetrating deep into the middle of the forest block and have an exponentially bigger footprint than you would right near the road. It also is a greater cost. Should there be a fire or whatever, you have to get the fire truck up that thing. And so there's a variety of issues why the town might want to limit the driveway length. Another way of doing it is through subdivision. So the town of Warren looks at connectivity through their subdivision standards. And they, until recently, have had a tiered system like the primary and conservation area and have put connectivity in there. Town of Waitsfield has a similar system where they looked at habitat blocks and connectivity. In their case, it was really looking at areas across Route 100 for connectivity. So those are just a few examples. There are many more. Connectivity is one of those concepts that has really emerged and changed a lot since I first started in 2008.
Where do we begin with that one, though? It's like, do we call a consultant in to help us figure it? Could you come in and help us figure that out? Or
Yeah, well, I mean, your consultant already has. And so then the question
by
is
telling us where the
crossings are,
vulnerable
where the
or
potential
whatever.
crossings are.
Yeah.
So then the question for you all is that too hot? Are there too many? Is your connectivity model too broad? Is that too much area along your major roads where you don't feel comfortable limiting development along that much strength of section of road? So then your question would be, how can we limit the amount of land we protect for connectivity? And so yes, a consultant could help you with that. But again, from an ecological standpoint, that's really tough because you have so much forest on both sides of the road. So it's almost a conservation planning exercise of saying, we want to maintain this and draw the line there and let the rest be developed. It's a harder argument with your citizens because it comes across as arbitrary.
Yeah.
And yet, it is a way of limiting the total area that you're protecting. And you're saying, in the future, that will be developed. In the future, what we've left undeveloped will matter more. And so it will serve as connectivity into the future. So there's some problems here, for sure. It's a tough business. And it's a tough business because you have so much good quality forest on both sides of your road.
So you mentioned that setting, say, a house back from the road allows for the connectivity, so you have the forest near the road, basically. So that if you have the driveway going in at a fair distance, you keep more forest next to the road, and that allows for more connectivity, right? I think you mentioned that.
Yes, and it depends. If you have a string of long driveways and a series of houses, it doesn't matter if they're 100 meters back or right beside the road. If there's a solid line of houses, that's a problem for connectivity. If there's one house and instead of putting it right in the middle of the connectivity area, you set it back, then there's still forest that connects from the deep forest block to the road segment to the other deep forest block. So it depends.
You know, one of the nice things about Underhill is the variations of the terrain, so that finding a place where a house fits, you just don't get lines of houses typically in Underhill. There's some places, yes, but mostly there's just spread around, basically. I guess these are the sort of discussions we'll get into, basically, as we get more details.
I'm sorry, Jens, I just wanted to ask you, I've heard you talk about before an area of disturbance around development. Isn't there a certain diameter around a piece of developed land that animals no longer use? Do I remember something like that?
Yes and no. When you say animals, so it depends. Deer are still going to come up and eat the hosta in your backyard. That you're still going to have skunks and raccoons. They don't care about. They are doing better in the suburban landscape. But research in the Adirondacks has shown that one house can have an impact of 200 acres for interior deep forest songbirds. So some species that are accustomed to deep, dark woods are going to feel the impacts of development. And so that's where you're really changing, and goes back to that idea of limiting driveway length. When you're penetrating deep into the block, you're having an outsized impact on those deep forest species.
I think that in terms of impact on, for example, we've been interested in trails and things and driveways that are the same. New Hampshire uses 400 feet on either side of a trail or a road that says that impacts the wildlife to a point, and the connectivity of things. And I think Vermont doesn't Vermont say that 300 feet on either side impacts animals and rare species, birds, and the habitat?
I'm not comfortable saying that as a blanket statement, no. So I don't know specifically which one you're talking about. It really depends on the animals. And from my standpoint, trails and roads are very different. And you can have a closed canopy over top of a trail, class 4 road, or potentially even a class 3 road. You might have a closed canopy. By the time you hit an interstate, you definitely don't have a closed canopy. So I don't think we can just say there's a one size fits all here, in my standpoint.
On this, the rivers and streams, the 50-foot buffer, when you read the Underhill zoning, how it applies to rivers and streams, if you read, what do you think of our regulations? Can you offer an opinion on that, or? Because we've had a discussion about this. Where is the edge of the stream? Should we use unnamed streams as treat them the same as a named stream? Could you read those, or could you just look at those briefly, or have you, or can you offer an opinion on that, or?
Sure. I think they're river scientists that. So I can offer an opinion from a wildlife standpoint. I think our Department of Environmental Conservation would have a thing or two to say from a river standpoint, and so I don't want to overstate my my expertise here and hit into their wheelhouse. But flooding is affecting Vermont communities, and the more area beside the stream and river where we limit development, the more we're doing to increase values like water quality, flood protection, and wildlife habitat. So from my standpoint, protection of rivers and streams, and riparian vegetation in particular, is probably the single most important climate resilience thing that we can do. And you all here in Underhill see some very flashy flooding. Over the last few years, I remember a few instances where you've had some real flashy events that we haven't had elsewhere in Vermont. And so this is a way of saying the more you can do to protect your streams and streamside vegetation, the better. I can't speak to the utility of using top of bank versus stream centerline. The advantage of using stream centerline is that in a mapping context, you can figure out where that is and draw the buffer. The advantage of using top of bank is that when you're on the ground in the real world, you can spot the top of bank. So, I'm politely making sure that, yeah.
Any questions from anyone online? You can just unmute and speak up.
Well, my service to you all is not done. I mean, unless you want it to be done. I'm available to help and to continue mapping. And so, if there are things that you want to explore in terms of different ways of slicing and dicing, we can sure do that, and I'm happy to work with you all to do that. So, for example, if you wanted to use Arrowwood's forest blocks, the CHUs, instead of S4, S5 natural communities, it's effectively the same area, but those are the sorts of swap outs we could do, or whatever. As you all are wrestling with what the appropriate balancing act for town is, you can tell me what sort of things you want to explore, and I can map those for you.
Penny Miller. Jens, is there someone comparable to you that offers this service from the state relative to streams and water courses?
The DEC Rivers program is an excellent source of information. Yes, and so they do have river scientists, and the Rivers program does offer technical assistance. I would bet it's Stacy Pomeroy out of the Essex office who is responsible for Underhill.
Yeah, and Stacy has offered to come back again. So I think once we get into some details and have, a slew of questions, it would be a great time to invite her back and see what she thinks about some of those things. While I'm speaking, I'll just say some of the, Penny did a lot of work researching what Underhill zoning regs we have already, and what you see here are a lot of those. A few of them are not really regulations, they're more, if we see them, we might, ask people to move it. That's not really a regulation. So you just want to bear that in mind, that some of them are stronger than others there.
I got one more question. So could you share with us what other towns do as far as clearing building sites and driveways, and because some folks have built houses in town and they've cleared like 100 feet either side of their driveway and just cut everything down. And could you tell us what other towns have handled, how they've handled that?
I am a little out of my depth here, but I believe you, and Larry, you may know better than I do, I believe the Planning Commission can establish a building envelope, which is how much cleared area is acceptable for each house or unit that's built. My understanding of Vermont law is that you don't have the authority to regulate forestry or the amount of cutting that happens on a private land, but you do have the ability to regulate a building envelope. So you could describe the size of the maximum size of a building envelope within each of your zoning districts. You can't cut anything down outside. Well, that sentence I don't think that's true. You, as part of the clearing, as part of the development process, you can't clear more than the building envelope. But you as a planning commission don't have the authority to regulate beyond, for forestry practices. So if a year later that landowner were to go through and cut as part of a forestry operation, that would not be your purview to regulate, is my understanding. So you can control the building envelope, but what happens after that is not your purview.
Yeah, in my experience, building envelopes come up normally in the course of a subdivision review. And so if you're carving up a larger lot into building lots, you can designate building, and often planning commission or DRBs do this. They designate a building envelope, and it doesn't restrict tree cutting. It does restrict where you can build or not build new structures. So, I mean, it's possible, I think, to change the regulations so that the building envelope would restrict cutting, but that's not how it was done, for example, in Charlotte, where I formerly worked. It just restricts what you can build or not build.
Yeah, I think if you go in for a simple building permit, the owner just selects, I'm going to build here or wherever, basically. Mm-hmm. I suppose after that has been selected, I suppose you could say, well, then this will be your building envelope, which would be a limitation of some sort. That might be one way of doing things.
Yeah, I think you get pretty hard pushback from a lot of property owners on that concept. You know, we had the Conservation Commission in Charlotte was fairly aggressive in suggesting changes to the rules, and that was one of the changes that they suggested. And I mean, it was pretty boggling to think how that would actually work on a day-to-day basis, because it really would restrict property owners' rights a lot. And, you know, if it's part of a subdivision, that's another story, because, you know, often with a subdivision, there's a quid pro quo where the DRB will tell a property owner, well, you can, say you have a 20-acre former farm, you can carve 4 or 5 acres, you could carve it up into 4 or 5 acre parcels and have widely dispersed houses, but it's going to use up a lot more of the farm lot. Or instead, you could cluster those building lots and agree to leave the rest of the land open in perpetuity and actually deed over the development rights to the town or to a land trust. And that was the preferred approach. And in that situation, instead of coming up with a 5-acre lot, building lot, you'd have like a 1 acre or a 2 acre lot, and then further restrict within those smaller building lots where a landowner could put a house and a garage, et cetera. But again, it was not to restrict tree cutting, it was to restrict where you could build on your subdivided lot.
Got to get my firewood in. So are there any more questions, basically? This has been great. This has been really wonderful, Jens. That was very informative, very important for us to have that. So I personally very much appreciate your presentation. I'm sure that others feel similar about that. And look forward to having further communications with you in the future as we do some more planning work.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So on our agenda, our next piece here is review and approve the minutes. Everybody has looked them over. Has everybody on the Planning Commission had a chance to look over the minutes? Everybody ready? Okay, well, we'll put it off then to, yeah, we'll do that next meeting then. Yeah, okay. Well, that sort of wraps up our business.
Can I interject? Larry, is it possible, I don't know who set up, did you set up the OneDrive or? Who set up you set up the OneDrive? No?
You mean posted things to online?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it, for us lazy, not very tech savvy people that with some of that, is it possible to attach those as PDFs as well?
Yeah.
Sorry. I might get to it and not forget, because that's kind of like my reminder to just see that like PDF kind of lingering on my computer, where it kind of out of sight, out of mind when it's in the OneDrive or whatever it is.
Yeah, post it to the website. We used, in Charlotte, we used to keep a separate Dropbox account, and that was a way of sharing documents ahead of the meetings. But then people would just like get all caught up in Dropbox issues, and it's like, oh, you have to download the app so you can see everything, and oh, what happens when you want to make changes? How do you just make sure those are distributed out to everybody? And so we ended up just moving everything. When we updated our town website, we moved everything to the town website and just said, you can just go to the website calendar for upcoming meetings, double click on the meeting, and that'll open up all the attachments that are in the meeting packet there. And it also saves the problem of, sometimes if people have a slow internet connection, it can take a long time to download a bunch of docs that are attached to an email, whereas if it's sitting on a website, usually it's a little quicker to get to and open.
I'll probably get there, but like maybe as we slowly move there, so we're not just going like cold turkey or hot turkey or whatever way you want to go with it on this
Leftover
process.
turkey.
Yeah.
Go to the calendar. Yeah. So do we have any further business? If not, I'll
make a
entertain a motion. Sandy?
To adjourn.
Second for adjournment? Roy? All in favor? Aye. Aye. Very good. Well, thank you all.